Welcome to Skinner 265, produced by the Portland, Oregon chapter of the American Guild of Organists, where our mission is to foster a thriving community of musicians who share their knowledge and inspire passion for the organ. I am Dr. Walter Krieger, Dean of the Portland chapter, and one of your hosts today. Our program will constitute a tribute and virtual farewell to this vintage E.M. Skinner pipe organ, long part of Portland, Oregon history, since it will be soon leaving Portland for greener pastures. We are pleased that it has found a new home. This organ, presently housed here at Alpenrose Dairy, represents ideals of American organ building in the early 20th century. The builder, Ernest M. Skinner, being a leader in this field. An orchestral model was the basis for the organ. Skinner's inimitable stops, for which he became famous, such as the English horn, the French horn, the orchestral oboe, and the like, are all present here. However, this particular Skinner organ is unique in another way. It has not been altered, enlarged, revoiced, or significantly changed in all these years, as so many similar instruments have been. It may rightly be considered in original condition. It is possible to hear and enjoy the original sounds of this instrument even from the distance of 100 years. Historically, this organ was, from Skinner's earliest years, the 165th organ built and given the opus number 265. It was Skinner's first large organ for an auditorium and predicted to be one of the most notable organs in the Pacific Northwest. Jonathan Ambrosino, a recognized scholar on E.M. Skinner, wrote of this organ after a visit to Portland in 2012. He writes, "It's the largest unaltered E.M. Skinner I've seen. That the organ is to be truly preserved without change or addition is important. Our opportunities for experiencing the early unaltered Skinner organ are rarer and rarer." What follows then is a brief history of this instrument in sight and sound. There will be 4 presenters. We will discuss, number 1, the grand beginnings of this instrument in 1916. Number 2, how the organ was redeemed from storage in 1971 and given a new home. And 3, how the organ was chosen for the 1997 Organ Historical Society Convention. You will hear some interesting stories about Alpenrose Dairy and answer the question, what's a pipe organ doing in a dairy? Enjoy.
I'm Joe O'Donnell. I work for Bond Organ Builders Incorporated, and I'm the organist at First Unitarian Church of Portland. To sense the significance of this instrument, it's important to understand the organ scene in Portland in 1916. Portland has never been known for large church buildings, but at the time there were a few impressive instruments, though most were at least 20 years old. First Presbyterian Church had installed a 3-manual Ryder tracker in 1890, and 6 years later, First Baptist acquired its tubular pneumatic 3-manual Hutchings. And this was probably the largest instrument in town at the time the auditorium organ was being designed. The most modern organ of the day, at least in terms of responsive electropneumatic action, was the 3-manual 1915 Esty in the Reed College Chapel. Its ventral windchests, though an improvement over the tubular pneumatic action at First Baptist, or the Kimball then at Trinity, would have been no match for the double primary Pittman chests that Skinner would supply. This was important in the vast space of the auditorium. Placed in tall chambers, some pipes were easily 100 feet from the keyboards. This was an age of mass production in the organ industry. It seems inconceivable that the contract for the auditorium organ was signed in September 1916, and the organ was in place and playing barely 10 months later. And though it's tempting to think that Ernest M. Skinner might have had a soft spot in his heart for Portland, since he had been working for both Ryder and Hutchings when their respective Portland instruments were built, it's not at all certain that he took part in the installation. It is recorded that he personally supervised the finishing of the auditorium organ, but this was only one of the 20 or so organs his firm installed that year, and there are some comparably large instruments in that output. One thing we can say for certain is that Portland organists had never heard or played anything like it, except for those who might have journeyed to Seattle to experience the 1911 Skinner at Plymouth Congregational Church. This was a slightly smaller but strikingly similar 4-manual. Both instruments had the elegant Skinner draw-knob console with its generous array of couplers and convenient combination action. In both cases, there were 3 expressive divisions, including a solo organ. Plymouth had 3 Celeste registers. In Portland, there would be 4. These were certainly among the sonic innovations for Portland audiences and organ committees. And in the interval between these organs, Skinner developed and patented his most famous creation, the French horn. That stop alone indicates just how much influence the auditorium organ wielded. The contract for the 1928 Reuter organ in the new Temple Beth Israel specified that its French horn was to be a copy of the Skinner's. The Skinner influence shows in other aspects of that Reuter. The Reuter upped the ante with 5 enclosed divisions, including a floating string organ and an even more luxurious combination action. The large 1929 Moeller, which replaced the Ryder at First Presbyterian, was similarly symphonic in character and almost as large. First Baptist, by the way, would keep its Hutchings until 1958, when it was replaced by Austin. It should be noted that a symphonic organ is not necessarily a symphony hall organ, especially as such instruments had developed over the past 30 years or so. A symphony hall organ is designed as a partner to an orchestra. The symphonic organ of the early 20th century is an orchestra by itself. It was designed expressly for the playing of transcriptions, for a time when radio broadcasts and recordings were in their infancy. and for the accompaniment of major works by large choral societies. And such accompaniments were often, of course, also transcriptions from orchestral originals. The auditorium organ wasn't meant for the Saint-Saëns third or the finale of the Enigma variations. This is an organ that can play the Enigma variations by itself. Elements of the style inevitably migrated to ecclesiastical instruments, such as at Plymouth or Temple Beth Israel. Of course, two full-length 32-foot stops are the crowning glory of this organ, if that's a term that can be applied to such low registers. These are the only two such sets of wooden pipes you'll find anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. It's somewhat curious that Skinner felt the need to include them, especially since he was working to a price goal of $25,000. Austin's bid may have been as generous in appointments, but they may have presumed that the fame of their enormous organ for the San Francisco Pan-Pacific Exposition of 1915 would carry the day for them in the competition for the Portland instrument. Ernest Skinner, who was never very good at financial matters, probably wanted to make a splash, to have a calling card for future work in the Northwest. Sadly, however, neither E.M. Skinner nor the successor firm Aeolian Skinner ever really found a foothold here. In 2007, I helped install the first Aeolian Skinner in Seattle, 36 years after the company went out of business. At least in Portland, the lack of large church buildings also bespeaks a lack of wealthy congregations. And in the organ business, Skinner and Aeolian Skinner organs were as much status symbols as artistic achievements. There's a certain irony in the fact that even as the auditorium organ was being removed in the summer of 1966, the Werner Bosch tracker at St. Mark's was being readied for its inaugural recitals by E. Power Biggs. And while the two organs could hardly be more dissimilar, it wasn't changing tastes or the organ reform movement that caused the Skinners' temporary demise. The architects of the Civic Auditorium's remodeling were unwilling to allot the necessary space for the organ. Consider that low C alone of the 32-foot open not only requires almost 40 feet of height, but occupies 4 square feet of floor space. The Skinner was installed in 2 narrow, but very deep and very tall chambers on either side of the stage. When you think of how the Keller Auditorium is used today, such obstructions in the wings of the stage would be unthinkable. One crazy proposal was to relocate the organ to the basement and send its sound back to the auditorium over speakers. There was sufficient outcry over the impending loss of the organ that the civil authorities paid to have it dismantled and stored for the 5 years it took to find a new home. And here it has been preserved, meticulously installed by David Newman and carefully guarded under lock and key by Alpenrose, waiting to be discovered and once again acknowledged as the treasure it is.
I'm Jonas Nordwall. I'm the artistic music director and organist for Portland's First United Methodist Church. I'm presently celebrating my 50th year as the organist for that congregation, and I also had a very unique experience when I was 13 years old to have the opportunity to play Skinner 265. The visit was created by the local con organ dealer when he had a visiting artist who wanted to check the organ out, and there was a gentleman by the name of Gary Morris who had been playing that instrument for travelogues. And so we went down, played the organ, and next thing I know, I met the auditorium manager, Harry Hansen. And I had the luxury, if I would play for a couple travelogues, and it was just 30 minutes of music, I could get about an hour or so practice time on the organ without having to pay a fee. The downside to the whole location of the organ was that the stage manager's office was directly underneath the 32-foot bombards. And as a kid, that's what you go for. You wanted the shake and the rumble. And the stage manager's name was Don Dumas. Don would run out and just yell at me, and the basic threat was, play that one more time and I'm turning the power off and I'm throwing you out of the building. So I learned very quickly you had to be nice to stage managers. I kind of stayed involved with the instrument during the planning of the auditorium. Again, I was just a high school kid, but I got involved with the local guild of the American Guild of Organists. And I started going to some of the meetings and attended a couple that were joint meetings between the guild, the city planners, and the acoustician, who was Paul Veneclausen, a very high-profile person of that era. And he had a strange idea that maybe instead of having the instrument around the stage, because they were trying to get as much footprint for the orchestra or whoever was going to use the auditorium, they did not want to have the chambers where they had previously been. There was talk of even putting it on the back wall, but then they had to make an extension for storage out onto 2nd Avenue. Paul Veneclausen's idea was to place the pipes in chambers below the lobby area, use microphones to pick up the sound and bring it back into the main auditorium area. And he called that particular concept acoustic transfer. Well, as things turned out, I also spent 32 years of my career working for the Rogers Organ Company, and my very first job playing for them was in 1966. And then I got a phone call about 2 weeks later from Rod Jenkins wanting to know if I wanted a summer job for a few weeks. And I asked what that was. I thought it was going to be playing. He says, no, I got the bid to remove the Skinner from the auditorium. So there were 4 of us mainly involved with that process, plus Organ Transfer Company. And those 4 people were Dennis Hedberg, who was the last owner of the Organ Grinder restaurant, where I also played for a number of years. Andy Crow, who had been a previous employee at Rogers, and Dave McFarland, who was a neighbor of Dennis's. And it took us all of 3 weeks to get the instrument out. We did not turn it on before we removed it because there were issues that prevented us from doing that. But I can say it was a very remarkable opportunity, and also one that will never be duplicated because there was no OSHA at the time. And they had stripped away the grills, used a cutting torch to just let them fall down on the floor. And the instrument was sort of a strange instrument the way it was installed. As you faced the stage, on stage right was really the majority of the pipe work. You had the grate, the swell, and the solo divisions, plus the extension of the 32-foot bombard. On the right-hand side was the choir division, which was the quietest division of the whole organ, but you had the 32-foot open diapason and also the metal 16-foot violone. And when it came time to remove the 32s, even though they are in two sections, the transfer company decided they should come down complete. And I was elected to sit in a bosun's chair on top of low C, and when they pulled it up, I had to kick it out away from the wall and basically ride the pipe all the way down to the floor, which was about 67 feet. And as I said, OSHA would never let you do that. And back then, you know, as an 18-year-old, that was kind of a fun ride, let's put it that way. Also, when the decision was made not to return the organ at all, even though there was a lot of scuttlebutt about that, one of the commissioners, Connie McCready, was the one who was really favorable about what would be the future of the instrument. And it was to be put up for sale with the little sticker that it had to be playable somewhere in the Portland area. And at that time, I had a job at Congregation Neve Shalom in Southwest Portland. It was two Jewish congregations that had merged and built a larger temple. And there was plenty of room to install the instrument. However, when we looked at the entire project is when I was preparing to go study in Toronto at the conservatory. And there was another organist who represented another organ manufacturer. And he met with the powers that be at the synagogue, and his sales pitch was, why would you want an old beat up piece of junk like that Skinner? Here, I should sell you my product. And of course, you know, for people that are not musicians, that was a good sales pitch. Unfortunately, nothing ever happened. They didn't move forward with a new instrument. But then the Alpenrose people stepped up to the plate, and I had met Dave Newman because I'm also involved with the theater organ group. It's called the American Theater Organ Society, and we have a chapter here in the Portland area, and Dave was a member. And when he moved his entire operation up here with musical instruments, he was the perfect person to do the installation. He was a meticulous craftsman. His specialty was not doing pipe voicing, his specialty was doing mechanical rebuilding. And the instrument was really well installed. And I will say this, if there had been the opportunity to return it to the auditorium, I doubt it would have been the instrument that left the auditorium, because musical taste had changed a lot. There was a lot of talk about you needed to replace certain things with a different concept of sound. And so because of the Alpenrose involvement, it has preserved a very unique musical instrument. And as you will hear or already have heard, it was a very special instrument for its time, and had a lot of opportunities to be heard. There were many great players of the earlier 20th century who performed concerts on it. And about the last Publix concert was done around either 1959 or 60 by Virgil Fox, and I remember going to the concert. And the console that you see in the photos was very unique for its time. It had a lot of, I'd say, ergonomic features on it. However, they're not the same as they are today. And for example, you see two panels on the sides of the keyboards with the stops and draw knobs, and those are controlled by the buttons underneath the keyboards. What is not controlled is the row of stop tabs that's above the fourth keyboard. So anytime you wanted to make a certain sound change, you had to push one of the pistons that would take the draw knobs into their positions you wanted, and then you had to reach up and do something else with another hand to the coupler rail. And I just remember when we came in the auditorium, Virgil was still sitting at the console, and he was studying that coupler rail, which is unusual because he grew up playing instruments like this, where they were just plentiful in the Midwest and the East. So that is my part of the history of this particular instrument. And I know it's going to get a very good home where it's going.
I am Susan Werner Breiser, Sub-Dean of the Portland chapter of the American Guild of Organists and responsible for chapter programming. Alpenrose Dairy, a working dairy farm, remains the lone survivor of what was once a thriving community of suburban farms operated by Swiss immigrants. Florian Cardinal operated a dairy farm in the 1890s, delivering milk in 3-gallon cans by horse-drawn wagon to a restaurant in downtown Portland. Henry Cardinal, Florian's son, married Rosina Streif, daughter of the Swiss consul, in 1916. She put a name to the business after the famous little mountain flower that bloomed in the Swiss Alps, Alpenrose. Their dairy business grew steadily. After a major fire in 1943, the family purchased Elko Dairy, the present 52-acre site. The expansion of the Alpenrose vision led to the creation of Dairyland in the 1960s. While fully operating as a dairy farm, Alpenrose became more and more customer and community-centered. There were Easter egg hunts, family days in May, a 4th of July pageant, a Shetland Shodigo, Little League Baseball, quarter midget racing for ages 5 to 17, bicycle races on an Olympic-size velodrome, and last but not least, Christmas time in Dairyland. Portland celebrities such as Rusty Nails, the clown, were regular participants, and Dairyland quickly became a family favorite. The 4th of July pageant was truly star-spangled celebration in honor of our nation's birthday. A panorama of historic events and personalities, a thrilling show that traces our glorious history. This would include ceremonial reenactments of famous battles. Our Skinner organ, now a part of Dairyland, was included in this festivity. Part of the organ's installation included its ability to play through shutters outward to the open fields beyond to punctuate the battle scenes with marches and the like. A real pageant of Americana, complete with fireworks at the end of each performance. Christmas time in Dairyland was always a special occasion at Alpenrose, bringing audiences in the thousands each year to this magical world featuring Storybook Lane. This program's intent was to recapture the flavor of Christmas, as it used to be. With extravagant decorations and music, it was always free to the public. A special feature of Dairyland was Dairyville, a small, charming, old-timey village of false front shops filled with treasured antiques, a doll museum, an old-fashioned ice cream parlor, a harness store, and a music shop was a reminder of bygone era. Dairyville also houses the Opera House and Music Hall, where Skinner 265 lives, the centerpiece of Alpenrose's holiday celebrations. Built in 1960 from the ruins of a hay barn that had caught fire, the 600-seat Opera House quickly became a resource for local choirs and theater groups, such as the Northwest Senior Theater, who performed there year after year. Dairyland even offered museums for the curious, including David Bruce Newman's fascinating collection of mechanical musical instruments, which included a violano virtuoso, 3 band organs, a calliope, nickelodeons, victrolas, antique music boxes, and hundreds of ingenious devices of a bygone age. A collection of vintage fire engines and automobiles, also acquired by Newman, was displayed in what had been the old milking parlor. Bringing the Alpenrose story up to date, the dairy was sold in the fall of 2019 to Smith Brothers Farm with headquarters in Kent, Washington.
My name is Cliff Fairley, and I worked at Bond Organ Builders here in Portland for over 37 years, retiring in 2014. Growing up in Portland, the first time I went to the Alpenrose Dairy was when my third grade class visited on a school field trip, where each kid was allowed to milk a cow for a few seconds. Apparently, the cows are very patient here at Alpenrose. I became acquainted with the 1916 E.M. Skinner organ formerly at the Municipal Auditorium in Portland when it was played at my graduation from Grant High School in 1965 by Gerald Merriman, a Grant High English teacher. All I remember was Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance played for what seemed like forever as my class of 892, to my knowledge the largest graduating class in Oregon, marched in order to be seated. At that time, the auditorium had 4,500 seats, so there were enough that all of our parents and grandparents could attend. I believe this was one of the last times the organ was played in a formal setting at the auditorium, as the building renovation began very shortly after my graduation. I started working at Bond Organ Builders in October of 1978 and had completely forgotten about the Skinner organ. I knew that it was not in the auditorium anymore, until I was tapped to chair the 1997 Organ Historical Society Convention in Portland. It quickly became apparent that this organ should be included in the convention, and I made initial inquiries with the Cadenau family to see if this were possible. The family said yes. I was very well received by the family, and when I told them we wanted to serve a dinner on the grounds before the concert, they volunteered to pay for and serve the meal. The organ was another issue entirely. It was in disuse and had many problems. This was where the buck stopped. They would not pay for tuning or repairs. The family said no. Grant Sprague, who at the time was the service manager at Bond Organ Builders, and I decided that the two of us had to make all the repairs we could within our limited time of about 2 months, and spent many evenings working on the organ during those 2 months before the convention. Here are 4 of the main problems we found. Number 1, the console had never been rebuilt and caused numerous dead notes because the wiring had never been soldered to the pins. Soldering fixed a lot of the problems. We discovered one humorous wiring mistake. Low C and D, not C and C sharp, on the 32-foot open wood had their wires reversed, and apparently no one could tell. That was an easy fix. There were something like 10 reservoirs under the stage, supplying the myriad main and offset chests in this huge organ. All of them leaked badly. With such limited time and no money, Grant and I made temporary repairs with scraps of leather using a wonderful product called shoe goo. This quieted down the wind system immensely, but it was only temporary. The organ needed a lot of tuning, of course. It had been installed in the chambers built solely for the organ, with 2 tone openings for each division, one for the interior of the opera house and one on the back wall to speak to the great outdoors. The outside openings were never satisfactory and had one huge flaw. They let in a lot of dirt and cold air. The reeds were badly affected by the dirt and the cold. The tuba mirabilis was on 25 inches of wind and occasionally blew the treble pipes right out of their chest holes. Although the blower had been meticulously restored, the motor running the blower had to be sent out for new bearings before we could have the recital. Alpenrose Dairy had their motorman fix it here. This was about all we could do in a couple months, and the concert played by Robert Vickery was well received. Grant Sprague and I breathed a huge sigh of relief when it was over. I am very pleased that this significant and unaltered Skinner organ is getting a proper restoration in a pleasing and suitable place.